Tonight, I would offer my throat to my fated mate in front of the entire pack. Tradition called it an act of trust, but the only thing I felt from the alpha, my father, was the cold weight of his judgment. Something inside me knew this ritual would not end with a loving bite, but with the shedding of blood. Chapter 1. The Weight of the Moon. The sweat on my skin and the burn in my muscles were familiar comforts. A sharp grunt escaped my lips as I twisted, my practice blade a silver blur that sang through the air, missing my sparring partner by a breath. He was fast, but I was faster. Another spin, a feint to the left, and the flat of my blade rested against his throat. A victory. Yet, my heart didn't soar. It felt like a stone in my chest, because his approval wasn't the one I craved. From the shadows of the ancient oak, my father watched. The alpha. His presence was a physical weight, a cold pressure that made the summer air feel like ice. He stepped into the fading sunlight, his form casting a long, imposing figure across the packed earth of the training grounds. He wasn't a large man, but power clung to him like a second skin, heavy and suffocating. Again, was all he said. Not a command, but a statement of fact. His voice was gravel, smoothed by years of absolute authority. No warmth, no praise. Just a demand for more. Always more. I nodded to my partner, who scrambled back, his own relief a sharp scent in the air. We reset. The dance began anew, parry, dodge, strike, but my focus was fractured. My eyes kept flicking to the alpha, searching for a sign. A flicker of pride, a hint of a smile. I found nothing. His face was a mask carved from stone, his eyes chips of obsidian that saw everything and revealed nothing. "Your footwork is clumsy, Zara," he stated, his tone unchanged. "You rely too much on speed. A true beta anticipates. She does not simply react." Each word was a carefully aimed dart, finding the soft spots in my confidence. I wanted to scream that my speed had won me every match today. I wanted to howl that I was the best fighter of my generation, male or female, but those words would be a weakness in his eyes. So I bit my tongue until I tasted copper and simply said, "Yes, father." My deference was a shield and a cage. Later, as the moons began their ascent, he dismissed my partner with a flick of his wrist. We were alone. The sounds of the pack settling for the evening, the distant laughter, the crackle of cook fires, felt a world away. Here, there was only a tense, vibrating silence between us. He walked a slow circle around me, his gaze analytical like a breeder inspecting livestock. "The ceremony is tonight," he murmured, stopping in front of me. "Liam is a strong match. His bloodline is pure. You will not disappoint me." It wasn't a request for reassurance. It was an order, an expectation I was meant to fulfill without question. He saw the flicker of defiance in my expression before I could hide it, and his lips thinned into a line that was almost a sneer. "This is about more than you, child. It is about the strength of this pack. It is about tradition. It is about ensuring our legacy remains untainted." He spoke of legacy, but I saw the hunger in his eyes, a deep, unsettling avarice for control that had nothing to do with the good of our people. He wanted power, pure and simple. And I was just a pawn in his game, a daughter forged into a weapon. He turned to leave, his final words drifting back on the cooling air. "Do not fail." As his shadow receded into the growing darkness, a different sound caught my ear. It was Liam's voice, not from his quarters, but from the edge of the woods. Hushed, strained, and filled with a desperate anxiety I had never heard before. My blood ran cold, and for the first time, the coming ceremony felt not like a destiny, but a doom. Chapter 2. A Scent on the Wind. Drawn by a thread of unease, I moved through the trees, my steps silent on the carpet of fallen leaves. The forest was our sanctuary, a place of peace. But tonight it felt different. Tense. The very air seemed to hold its breath. I found him near the ancient border stone that separated our lands from the human towns beyond. Liam? My Liam. He wasn't alone. A girl stood before him, small and fragile under the moonlight. She was human. Her scent was a strange, sweet perfume of soap and sun-warmed skin that felt utterly alien in our world. It clung to Liam, an invisible stain on the familiar aroma of pine and wolf that I loved. My heart hitched, a painful, stuttering beat in my chest. What was this? He saw me then. His body went rigid, a bowstring pulled too tight. The easy posture he held with the girl vanished, replaced by a sharp, defensive stance. He said something to her, his voice too low for me to catch the words, and she scurried away into the undergrowth like a frightened rabbit, disappearing from sight. Liam turned to face me, a smile plastered on his face that didn't reach his eyes. His beautiful, expressive eyes were clouded, distant. "Zara, I was just getting some air before the ceremony. My nerves, you know?" He laughed, but the sound was hollow, a dead thing that fell flat between us. Nerves? Liam was one of the calmest wolves I knew. He faced down rogue bears without flinching. This wasn't nerves. This was fear. "Who was she, Liam?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. I wanted to be angry, to demand answers, to let my own wolf rise and snarl at the strange female's scent on my mate. But the desperate pain swimming in his gaze held me back. I saw a wolf caught in a trap, one he couldn't escape. He just shook his head, stepping closer to take my hands. His touch, usually a source of warmth and comfort, felt cold. No one, just a lost hiker. I was pointing her back toward the town. The lie was so blatant, so poorly constructed, it was almost an insult. Lost hikers didn't wander this deep into our territory. The magical wards we maintained made them feel a sense of deep, unexplainable dread long before they got this far. They always turned back. I should have pushed. I should have demanded the truth. My instincts were screaming, a silent howl in my soul telling me that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. I saw our whole future, the one I had dreamed of since we were pups tumbling in the grass, fracturing before my eyes. But then he looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the sheer terror there. It wasn't the fear of being caught. It was something deeper, something ancient and primal. It was the fear of a hunted animal. So I made a choice. I chose to trust him. Or perhaps I chose to trust the idea of him, the boy I grew up with, the wolf who was supposed to be my other half. "Okay," I whispered, letting him pull me into a hug that felt stiff and wrong. I buried my face in his neck, trying to find his true scent beneath the cloying sweetness of the human girl. It was there, but it was faint, buried under layers of anxiety and deceit. The ceremony will be perfect, I told myself as much as him. He pulled back, his hands on my shoulders, his gaze sliding away from mine. "Yes," he said, his voice a hollow echo of his usual vibrant tone. "Perfect." And as we walked back toward the heart of the pack, toward the ritual that would bind us forever, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking toward an execution. My own. Chapter 3. The Gilded Cage. The great hall was suffocating. Torches burned in their sconces, casting flickering shadows that danced like vengeful spirits on the ancient tapestries. The air, thick with the scent of ceremonial moon petal and beeswax, was heavy, pressing down on me with the weight of generations of tradition. This place should have felt like home, a symbol of our strength and heritage. Tonight, it felt like a gilded cage, beautiful and ornate on the outside, but designed to hold me captive. The elders began to file in, their faces grim and unreadable. They moved with a strange gliding uniformity, their robes rustling in the oppressive silence. There was no friendly chatter, no quiet murmurs. There was only the unnerving sight of them taking their seats in perfect, unsettling synchronicity. Then, my father entered. The Alpha. A hush fell over the assembled pack members. He walked to the ceremonial dais, his every step measured and deliberate. When he turned to face us, I saw it again, that strange, unnatural light gleaming in his eyes. It wasn't just the reflection of the torchlight. It was something else, a cold, internal fire that seemed to burn away any trace of the man who had once been my father. He raised his hands, and a wave of something washed over the room. It was like a dissonant chord played in the dead of night, a feeling of profound wrongness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. My nascent abilities, the strange psychic whispers I sometimes felt, recoiled from the sensation. It felt slick and dark and parasitic. Brothers, sisters, his voice boomed, imbued with a power that was more than just his alpha authority. It wrapped around his listeners, compelling them to hang on his every word. Tonight, we honor the traditions that have kept the Moonwood Pack strong. We celebrate purity, we celebrate strength. His words were the same ones he had spoken at every ceremony, but their meaning felt twisted now, curdled by the dark energy that radiated from him. He spoke of purity, but the feeling I got from him was one of corruption. He spoke of strength, but it felt like the iron-fisted rule of a tyrant, not the protective embrace of a leader. My gaze swept across the elders, and a new horror dawned on me. The light in my father's eyes was reflected in theirs. All of them. He continued his speech, his voice rising in a hypnotic cadence. We will cut out the weakness in our midst. We will not tolerate any taint from the outside world. Our bloodline is our bond, our shield, our weapon. A fervent, almost fanatical cheer rose from the pack, but it sounded rehearsed, hollow, as if they were puppets, and he was the one pulling the strings. I looked at Liam, standing near the dais, his face pale and slick with sweat. His eyes were wide with a terror that mirrored my own. He knew. He knew something about this darkness, and it was breaking him. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird beating against the bars of a cage. This wasn't a ceremony. It was a consecration to some dark power I couldn't name. The speech ended. My father's eyes, burning with that cold, unholy light, found mine across the hall. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Then, as if moved by a single will, every elder in the hall turned their heads at the exact same moment. They all stared directly at me. Their faces were blank, their expressions identical, their collective gaze an intense, piercing force that felt like a physical blow. There was no individuality, no recognition, no warmth. There was only the silent, unified stare of dozens of wolves, all looking through me as if I were already a ghost. And in that terrifying, synchronized moment, I finally understood the truth my instincts had been screaming all day. I wasn't here to be mated. I was here to be sacrificed. Chapter 4. An Offering of Ash. The ritual began. My father's voice, a resonant drumbeat of ancient words, filled the great hall. I was called forward. Each step I took toward the dais felt like wading through thick, heavy mud. The eyes of my pack were on me, their collective gaze 1,000 tiny needles against my skin. Hope. It was a foolish, stubborn thing. A tiny flicker of it remained in my heart, whispering that my instincts were wrong, that Liam would honor our bond, that this nightmare would end. He stood waiting, a statue carved from fear. His face was a waxy, pale mask, his knuckles white where he gripped his own arms. He looked like a man being led to the gallows. I was supposed to be his future. Why did he look at me like I was his end? I reached the platform and knelt before him, as was tradition. The scent of the ceremonial moon petal was cloying, almost sickening. I bowed my head, my hair falling like a curtain around my face and exposed the arch of my throat. This was the moment, the ultimate gesture of a wolf to her mate. It was an offering of absolute trust, a baring of the most vulnerable part of myself. I was giving him my life, my future, my loyalty, all in this single, silent act. The air grew still. The crackle of the torches seemed to fade into nothingness. A full minute passed, stretching into an eternity. A confused murmur rippled through the assembled pack. My own heart began to hammer a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. "Do it, Liam. Please. Just do it." "No." The word was a choked, broken whisper. It was so quiet I almost didn't hear it, but it echoed in the cavernous silence of the hall like a thunderclap. My head snapped up. I stared at him, my mind refusing to process what my ears had heard. His eyes were swimming with tears. A desperate, agonizing pain etched onto his features. He looked at me, and in that gaze I saw a universe of apology and self-loathing. He took a staggering step back, away from me, away from my offering. "I can't," he said, his voice cracking, loud enough for everyone to hear this time. "I reject this mating." A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. My world. It didn't just crack. It shattered. It exploded into a million pieces of ice-cold humiliation. The shame was a physical force, a white-hot wave that threatened to swallow me whole. My vision narrowed to a single point. I was on my knees, my throat bare and unclaimed, a public spectacle of rejection. Laughter. Was that a snicker from the back? A whisper? Every sound was an accusation. Every gaze was a judgment. My father's roar of fury was a distant storm, a sound from another world. My immediate, all-consuming need was to disappear, to turn to smoke and ash and simply cease to exist. I wanted to run, to hide, to crawl into a hole and never see the light of day again. My life, my purpose, my entire identity had been built around this moment, and it had been publicly and brutally annihilated. Just as my spirit began to crumble into dust, a new scent slammed into the hall. It was wild and powerful, smelling of ozone after a lightning strike, of ancient pine forests, and of a primal rage that made the wolf inside me tremble. The great oaken doors of the hall burst inward, splintering from their hinges. A massive figure stood silhouetted against the night sky, his presence a sudden, shocking storm that silenced everything. Chapter 5. Marked by Shadow. He was a creature of darkness and power, not just a wolf, but the embodiment of the wild itself. The newcomer stepped over the threshold, and the torchlight caught the silver tips of his black fur, making him seem to glitter with his own cold light. He was huge, his shoulders broader than any wolf I had ever seen, his every movement a display of fluid, predatory grace. This was the Shadow Pack Alpha, Ken. A name whispered like a curse in our territory, a boogeyman to frighten pups. His golden eyes, luminous and intelligent, swept across the stunned hall, dismissing every snarling warrior, every shocked elder. He ignored the bristling rage of my father. His gaze landed on me, and it stayed. In that moment, the entire world, with all its noise and chaos, fell away. There was only the intensity of that stare, a focused, possessive heat that pinned me in place. The Moonwood warriors began to close rank, their own growls a rising tide of aggression. They were ready to fight, to tear this intruder apart for his audacity. My father took a step forward, his own alpha power flaring like a physical shield. "You dare step foot in my hall, Shadow Wolf?" he bellowed, his voice shaking with a rage so profound I could feel the vibrations in the floor. "You have no place here." Ken didn't even grant him a sideways glance. He simply continued his slow, deliberate walk toward the dais, toward me. The sea of my hostile packmates parted before him, an unspoken understanding passing between them. This was a fight none of them could win. He moved with the calm certainty of a hurricane, a force of nature that could not be stopped or turned aside. My mind was a whirlwind of shock and fear. I was still on my knees, frozen in my humiliation. Who was this wolf? Why was he here? And why was he looking at me as if he owned me? He stopped directly in front of me, blocking out the sight of everyone else. The sheer power radiating from him was breathtaking, a heady mix of dominance and raw masculinity that both terrified and intrigued me. He knelt, bringing his face level with mine, Up close, I could see the flecks of amber in his golden eyes, the hard line of his jaw, a faint scar that cut through one eyebrow. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers gently touching my cheek, and a jolt of electricity, hot and wild, shot through me. "Mine," he growled. The word was a low, possessive rumble, a claim spoken with absolute conviction. It was not a request. It was a declaration. Before I could process it, before my father could lunge, before a single warrior could move, he acted. He leaned in, his face burying in the curve of my neck. I felt the heat of his breath against my skin, the sharp prick of his canines. I braced for pain, but what came was something else entirely. It wasn't just a bite. It was an explosion. A supernova of energy erupted at the point of contact, a searing electric current that shot through every nerve in my body. A scream tore from my throat as the world dissolved into pure, blinding white light. The anchor bond. It snapped into place with the force of a tidal wave. And the quiet, nascent whispers in my mind, my hidden mindwalker gift, didn't just awaken. It roared to life, a psychic tempest that shattered all the walls in my consciousness, opening me up to a world I never knew existed. Chapter 6. The Bitter Truth. The light receded, but the visions remained. My mind, ripped open by the power of the anchor bond, was no longer my own. I was drowning in a flood of memories. Ken's memories. Images, sounds, and emotions crashed over me in a chaotic torrent. I saw a moonlit clearing much like our own, a family laughing, their faces filled with love. I felt the pride of a young wolf being named heir. Then fire, the acrid smell of burning wood and scorched earth, the screams of his pack, the confusion, the betrayal. I saw my father's face, younger but just as cold, standing in the shadows, a cruel, triumphant smile on his lips as he held a cursed object. He had framed them. He had used dark, forbidden magic to orchestrate their exile, to steal their lands, to destroy their lives. Ken's grief and rage were so potent, so raw, they became my own. My soul cried out with the agony of a loss I had not personally experienced but now felt to my very core. The psychic storm cleared, leaving behind a horrifying clarity. My new sight was a curse and a gift. I looked up from my position on the floor, my eyes finding my father across the dais. But I didn't just see him anymore. I saw the darkness. It was a tangible thing, a writhing, shadowy parasite of black, oily smoke that clung to his soul. It pulsed with every beat of his heart. Its tendrils wrapped around his spirit, twisting and corrupting it from the inside out. The unnatural light in his eyes was the glow of this malevolent entity, looking out through his pupils. He wasn't just a cruel man. He was a monster wearing my father's skin. The elders, too. Faint, wispy shadows clung to them, puppets controlled by the master parasite. "Traitor!" my father screamed, his voice distorted, layered with an inhuman rasp that came from the thing inside him. "You have sullied your bloodline with this filth." He pointed a trembling finger at Ken, who now stood beside me, a solid, unmovable mountain of silent fury. Ken didn't speak. He just watched me, his golden eyes intense, questioning. The choice was mine. I could stay. I could beg for forgiveness, accept whatever punishment my father, no, that thing, deemed fit. I could live a lie in this gilded cage, surrounded by the soulless puppets my pack had become, or I could choose the truth. A bitter, painful, terrifying truth, but the truth nonetheless. Slowly, shakily, I got to my feet. I met the monster's gaze, the entity that had stolen my father. All my life I had craved his approval, his love. Now I felt nothing but a profound, sorrowful pity for the weak man who had allowed himself to be consumed by such darkness. I lifted my chin, and the shame I had felt moments before was burned away by a new, cold resolve. "My pack is gone," I said, my voice clear and steady, ringing through the silent hall. "You destroyed it. My loyalty is to the truth, not to you." I turned my back on him. I turned my back on the dais, on the elders, on the confused faces of the wolves I had grown up with. I took a step, then another, walking away from my home, my past, my name. I walked toward the splintered doors where the night sky waited, following the dark, powerful wolf who had just claimed me as his own, and stepped into an unknown, terrifying new life. Chapter 7. The Shadow's Den. The journey was a long, silent trek through suffocating darkness. Ken moved ahead of me, a phantom of muscle and fury, his pace never slowing, his broad back a rigid wall of rejection. This new forest was nothing like my home. The neat, ordered paths of the Moonwood were gone, replaced by a wild, chaotic tangle of ancient trees and thorny undergrowth. The air here was different, too. Thicker, smelling of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the raw, untamed scent of his pack. It was the scent of freedom and of danger. My own wolf, which had been cowering in shame, stirred with a reluctant curiosity. This place was primal. It was real. It was everything our sterile, tradition-bound territory was not. We arrived without a word. The Shadow Pack's den wasn't a village. It was a sprawling network of caves carved into the base of a granite cliff, looking like a giant sleeping beast. Torches flickered at the mouths of the caverns, casting long, dancing shadows that made the rocks seem to breathe. Wolves began to emerge from the darkness, their eyes glowing like embers in the gloom. They were leaner than my people, their fur darker, their bodies covered in scars that spoke of a harder life. Low growls rumbled through the clearing, a wave of pure, undiluted hostility directed straight at me. I was the enemy, the daughter of the man who had wronged them. I raised my chin, refusing to let them see the terror that was clawing at my insides. A she-wolf, her face a mask of jagged scars and her one good eye burning with hatred, stepped forward to block Ken's path. "What is this?" she snarled, her voice a blade of rusted iron. "You bring a Moonwood bitch to our hearth? After what they did to us?" She spat the words at my feet. The venom in her tone was so potent I flinched. Ken didn't even look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the main entrance to the den. "She is my mate, Alara," he stated, his voice a low, cold thunder that promised violence. "She is under my protection. Challenge me on this again, and you will lose your other eye." The threat was so brutal, so matter-of-fact, it silenced the entire clearing. Ilara recoiled, a flicker of fear in her scarred face before melting back into the crowd. He had defended my place here. But it felt less like a rescue, and more like a declaration of ownership. He led me to a small, isolated cave near the edge of the den. It was barren, furnished with nothing but a pile of furs in the corner. He tossed a bundle of dark, homespun clothes at my feet. "Get some rest," he commanded, his tone flat and devoid of any emotion. He offered no comfort, no explanation, no gentle touch that the new, humming bond between us seemed to crave. He was a stranger, a cold, distant captor who had saved me from one prison only to lock me in another. I wanted to scream at him, to demand why he had done this, why he had marked me only to treat me like a distasteful spoil of war. But I saw the deep, unrelenting pain in his eyes, the ancient grief he carried, and the words died in my throat. This wolf was more broken than I was. He turned and left without another word, leaving me utterly alone. From the mouth of my cold stone room, I watched him leap to a high, rocky ledge overlooking the den. He stood there for hours, a solitary sentinel, his unreadable gaze fixed on my cave as if I were a puzzle he couldn't solve, or a bomb he was terrified might explode. Chapter 8. A Dance of Power. For 3 days, I was a ghost, a phantom that drifted at the edges of the Shadow Pack, seen by all but acknowledged by none. They didn't threaten me again. Ken's warning had been clear, but their hatred was a constant, suffocating pressure. It was in their glares as I walked to the stream, in their whispers as I tried to eat, in the way they turned their backs when I approached. I was alone, adrift in a sea of silent animosity. Ken remained a distant, brooding presence. He made sure I was fed, that I was safe, but he did not speak to me. The bond between us was a raw, aching nerve, a connection that hummed with a desperate need for contact that he clearly refused to grant. I couldn't live like this. I was a warrior, not a victim. I would not let them, or him, break me. On the fourth morning, as I sat polishing a dagger I'd been given, his shadow fell over me. I looked up to see him standing there, his face an unreadable mask of cold indifference. Without a word, he tossed a heavy, blunted practice sword at my feet. It clattered on the stone floor. "Get up," he ordered. His voice was rough, challenging. "I want to see the skills of a Moonwood beta. Show me you are more than just your father's pretty, discarded toy." The insult was a deliberate spark to the tinder of my anger. It worked. A hot, cleansing fury burned away my fear and despair. I rose to my feet, my own practice blade feeling light and familiar in my hand. "You will regret that," I said, my voice low and steady. A flicker of something, surprise, interest, danced in his golden eyes. The entire pack gathered to watch, forming a silent, judgmental circle around the dusty clearing we used as a training ground. They expected me to be crushed. They wanted to see the Moonwood princess humiliated. The fight began without a signal. Ken came at me with brutal, overwhelming force, his sword a whirlwind of powerful strikes designed to batter me into submission. He was stronger than anyone I had ever fought, his power raw and untamed. I couldn't meet his strength with my own. So I didn't try. I became water, flowing around his attacks, using his own momentum against him. My father had called my footwork clumsy, but it allowed me to be fast, to be unpredictable. I dodged, I weaved, I parried at the last possible second, my blade a whisper against his thunder. He fought with rage. I fought with my mind. Frustration grew on his face. He was used to enemies who met his force with their own. He wasn't used to a fighter who anticipated his moves, who turned his assault into a dance. He lunged, a powerful, overextended strike meant to end it. I saw it coming. I dropped low, spun inside his guard, and hooked my foot behind his ankle. At the same time, I brought the pommel of my sword up, striking his wrist with a sharp crack. His sword flew from his grasp, landing in the dust a dozen feet away. My blade was at his throat. The clearing was dead silent. I could hear the shocked breaths of the onlookers. Ken stared at his empty hand, then his golden eyes lifted to meet mine. The fury was gone. In its place was a raw, stunned disbelief. And something else. A spark of grudging, fiery respect. He didn't say a word. He just pushed my blade aside, retrieved his sword, and walked away from the circle. But I felt it. A warm, powerful pulse surged through the anchor bond, a wave of his startled admiration washing over me. It was the first time the mark on my neck felt less like a scar and more like a promise. Chapter 9. Echoes in Stone. The fight changed things. The pack's open hostility cooled into a wary, grudging acceptance. They still watched me, but now their eyes held a flicker of respect instead of pure contempt. I was no longer just the Moonwood bitch. I was the wolf who had disarmed their alpha. Ken continued to keep his distance, but the wall of ice between us had a hairline crack in it. Sometimes I would catch him watching me, and the bond would hum with a confusing mix of his emotions, anger, curiosity, and a strange protective warmth he tried so hard to conceal. I began to explore the territory, needing to map it in my mind, to understand the wild land that was now my home. As I walked, I felt a strange pull, a low thrumming vibration that only I seemed to notice. It was a psychic resonance that tickled the edges of my new, heightened senses, drawing me toward the oldest part of the den. I followed the feeling deep into the mountain, into a cavern that was clearly ancient and sacred. The air was still and cold, smelling of deep stone and the dust of millennia. Unlike the other caves, this one was not empty. Its walls were covered from floor to ceiling in intricate carvings, a vast, sprawling tapestry of our people's history etched into the rock. I ran my fingers over the rough surface, and as I touched the images, my Mindwalker ability flared to life. The carvings weren't just pictures anymore. They were memories, echoes of the past trapped in stone, and they flooded my mind. I saw the beginning. Two great packs, the wolves of the moon and the wolves of the shadow, living in harmony. They were not rivals, but two halves of a whole, their alphas bound by a sacred pact. Then the images darkened. I saw the arrival of a faceless evil, a creeping shadow that whispered promises of power into the ears of the greedy. It was a parasite that fed on ambition and fear. I witnessed the first betrayal, a Moonwood alpha generations ago who listened to those whispers. He broke the pact, drove the shadow pack from their ancestral lands, and began a long bloody feud. My own pack. We were the villains in this story. The history I had been taught was a lie, a carefully constructed narrative to hide our shame. My mind reeled. This wasn't just about my father. It was an ancient corruption, a sickness that had festered in my bloodline for centuries. I stumbled deeper into the cave, my hand tracing the prophetic final panels of the story. The carvings depicted a time of ultimate crisis, when the shadow entity would rise again, powerful enough to consume the world. It spoke of a last hope, a new anchor bond, forged in betrayal and fire, between a wolf of the moon and a wolf of shadow. A bond that would either unite the packs and destroy the darkness, or fail, shattering the last remnants of our world. My breath hitched. Ken and I. We weren't just two wolves caught in a feud. We were the inheritors of this terrifying destiny. I reached the very last carving, tucked away in a dark corner of the cave. My fingers traced the familiar shape, and a jolt of pure ice shot through my veins. It was the image of an alpha wolf, his body twisted and warped by the shadowy parasite I had seen clinging to my father. His eyes, even carved in stone, glowed with that same malevolent, unholy light. The ancient evil wasn't just a memory. It was alive, and it was wearing my father's face. Chapter 10. First Blood. The silence in the ancient cave was thick with the weight of prophecy. I had just finished explaining what I'd seen in the carvings, my voice echoing in the vast, stony chamber. Ken stood with his back to me, his powerful shoulders rigid as he stared at the final chilling image of the corrupted wolf. The anchor bond between us was a tense, thrumming wire, alive with his disbelief and his dawning horror. He had spent his life consumed by a quest for revenge against a man, but the carvings revealed a different enemy, an older, darker foe that wore my father's face like a mask. He finally turned, his golden eyes blazing with 1,000 questions I couldn't answer. "If this is true," he began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "If this shadow is real—" He never finished the sentence. A warning howl, sharp and laced with terror, ripped through the air outside, shattering the fragile peace. Instantly, the tension between us changed. It was no longer the strain of revelation, but the sharp, unified focus of two predators sensing a threat. We moved as one, bursting out of the cave and into the main clearing. Chaos. A small, elite group of Moonwood warriors had breached the den's defenses, their silver-laced blades gleaming under the midday sun. They fought with a desperate, silent ferocity, their eyes holding the same blank, uniform intensity as the elders. They weren't just soldiers following orders, they were puppets, their strings pulled by the dark magic that now controlled my home. Ken let out a roar, a true alpha command that shook the very stones, and the Shadow Pack warriors surged to meet the invaders. The clearing exploded into a maelstrom of flashing steel and snarling wolves. I drew my own blade, my heart pounding a frantic war drum against my ribs. These were wolves I had known my whole life. I had trained with them, shared meals with them. Now they looked at me with empty, murderous eyes. My Mindwalker ability, once a confusing whisper, was now a powerful weapon. I could feel their intentions, a split-second premonition of their attacks. "Left flank!" I yelled, seeing a mental image of a warrior preparing to ambush Alara. She spun, her blade meeting his with a shower of sparks. The bond between Ken and me became a conduit of pure battlefield instinct. I didn't need to see him to know where he was. I felt his lunge, his parry, his spin. We moved in a deadly, unspoken sync, covering each other's backs, a two-wolf storm cutting through the ranks of our enemies. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. For the first time since being marked, we were truly connected, our movements a seamless dance of death. We were turning the tide. The Moonwood wolves, though fanatical, were outnumbered. Their soulless coordination was no match for the Shadow Pack's fierce, wild passion. I saw the last two warriors exchange a look. I felt their sudden shift in purpose, a wave of pure, suicidal desperation. They weren't trying to win anymore, they were trying to send a message. One of them charged Ken, a clear distraction. The other, the largest of the group, broke from the fight and lunged directly at me. His eyes were locked on my throat, his silver blade raised for a killing blow. I had no time to react. I braced for the impact, for the searing pain of silver. It never came. A black-furred blur slammed into me, knocking me off my feet. It was Ken. He had thrown himself in front of me, taking the blade that was meant for my heart. It sank deep into his side with a sickening thud. He cried out, a sharp, agonized sound that was torn from his soul and echoed directly into mine. The last attacker was cut down by Alara, and a sudden, ringing silence fell over the clearing. Then Ken collapsed, his hand clutching the hilt of the blade buried in his ribs, a river of dark, crimson blood staining the earth beneath him. Chapter 11. The Fever. The world became a suffocating haze of pain. Ken's pain. They carried him to his cavern, the pack's healer, an old, wizened she-wolf, working frantically to stem the bleeding. But it wasn't an ordinary wound. The blade was laced with silver, a poison that burned through a shifter's veins like liquid fire. I refused to leave his side. I knelt beside his cot of furs, my hands gripping his, trying to offer a strength I did not feel. The anchor bond, which had been a channel of instinct on the battlefield, was now a conduit of pure agony. A phantom fire erupted in my own ribs, a ghost of his wound that made me gasp for breath. His fever began to rise, and his delirium became my own. The stone walls of the cavern seemed to shimmer and warp around me. His mind, stripped of its defenses by the poison, was an open book, and the bond pulled me in. I wasn't just seeing memories anymore. I was living them. I was a small boy, hiding behind a tree, watching in helpless terror as my home burned. I felt the shame of being unable to help, the grief of seeing my parents stripped of their titles and cast out. I tasted the ash on the wind and felt the sting of tears from a sorrow so profound it threatened to drown me. I felt Ken's lifelong burden, the crushing weight of his failure to protect his family, a failure that had forged his anger, his coldness, his entire identity. His icy walls weren't built to keep others out. They were built to hold his own shattered heart together. My hatred for my father curdled into something deeper, more sorrowful. He hadn't just hurt this man. He had hollowed him out, leaving nothing but a desperate need for a vengeance that could never heal the original wound. The pack's healer forced a bitter tea between his lips, but he thrashed, lost in the inferno of his past. "Zara," I whispered, my own voice hoarse, my forehead slick with a sweat that wasn't mine. "Ken, I'm here. Fight it." The bond ached, a raw, open wound between our souls. It was a channel for his pain, but maybe it could be a channel for my strength, too. I closed my eyes, focusing all my will, all my energy, into that single point of connection. I poured every ounce of my resolve, my determination, my fierce desire for him to live, into the bond. I imagined my energy as a cool silver light, pushing back against the raging fire of the fever. I felt a subtle shift. The frantic, chaotic energy coming from him lessened, just a fraction. He was fighting back. Hours passed in a blur of shared agony and focused will. Finally, the violent thrashing subsided. His breathing, which had been ragged and shallow, began to deepen. The fever was breaking. I opened my eyes, exhausted, my body feeling as if it had been the one to fight a war. He was still, his face pale in the torchlight. His eyes fluttered open. They weren't the unfocused eyes of a delirious man anymore. They were clear, and they were looking right at me. A faint, trembling smile touched his lips. "Zara," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a statement. It was a breath, a prayer. He squeezed my hand weakly. "It was always you," he murmured, his eyes drifting shut. "Even before the mark, my wolf, it knew you." He fell into a deep, healing sleep, his confession hanging in the air between us. And I knew, with a certainty that shook me to my core, that the bond between us was no longer a curse of fate. It was a choice, and we had both just made it. Chapter 12. A New Alliance. 2 days passed in a quiet vigil. Ken slept, his body knitting itself back together with the incredible speed of a healing shifter. I never left his side, dozing in a chair, my hand resting near his. The pack, led by a surprisingly deferential Ilara, brought me food and water, their gazes no longer hostile, but filled with a quiet, watchful respect. They had seen me fight for their alpha, not just with a blade, but with my very will. I was no longer an outsider. I was one of them. On the third morning, I woke to find him watching me, his golden eyes clear and sharp. He was propped up against a pile of furs, his wound tightly bound, the color returning to his face. The charged silence of the cavern felt different now, stripped of its previous anger and filled with an unspoken, fragile tenderness. "You stayed," he said, his voice rough but steady. It wasn't a question. I simply nodded. "The bond," he started, then stopped, searching for the right words. "I'm sorry, Zara, for how I treated you. The coldness. It was a shield. When I saw you, the daughter of the man I'd sworn to destroy, and my wolf screamed mate, I thought it was a trick, a curse." His confession was a balm on a wound I hadn't realized was so deep. "I know," I said softly, and he understood that I meant it. I had seen his past. I had felt his pain. There were no more secrets between us. "Ken, what I saw in the carvings, it's true. The dark magic, the parasite on my father's soul. It's real. He's not just a tyrant. He's a vessel for something ancient and evil." The last of his anger seemed to drain away, replaced by a grim, weary understanding. We weren't enemies anymore. We were soldiers on the same side of a war we were just beginning to comprehend. We talked for hours. For the first time, we were not a captor and his prize, not rivals bound by fate. We were partners, allies, Ken and Zara. We spoke of the prophecy, of the 2 wolves destined to unite the packs. We spoke of his exile, of my father's betrayal, piecing together the timeline of his corruption. The weight of it all was staggering, an impossible burden that threatened to crush us. But for the first time, we were sharing it. We were not alone. "We can't just wait for him to attack again," I said, my voice filled with a new, hard resolve. "He is twisting the Moonwood Pack into his personal army. He's using them, poisoning them. We can't save them by hiding here." I saw the same conclusion dawning in his eyes. The need for revenge had been burned out of him by the fever, replaced by the grim determination of a true alpha, who saw a threat to all wolves, not just his own. This was bigger than our history. It was about our future. "We have to go back," I stated, the words tasting like both poison and promise on my tongue. "We have to go to the heart of my old home and find the source of this rot." He looked at me, his golden eyes searching my face. I saw no hesitation there, only a mirrored determination. "No," he said, his voice firm. He reached out, his hand covering mine, his touch warm and solid. "Not you. We go back together." Later that day, we stood before the assembled shadow pack. Ken, leaning on me for support, announced our plan. A wave of murmurs and fearful glances went through the crowd, but no one protested. They looked at us, Their wounded alpha and the Moonwood she-wolf who had saved him, and they saw what we had finally become. A unit. A promise. A new alliance forged in blood and fire, ready to march into the heart of the darkness. Chapter 13. An Unlikely Ally. Returning to the Moonwood was like walking into a memory that had started to rot from the inside out. The forest looked the same. The ancient oaks, the familiar winding paths, the scent of pine and damp earth. But beneath it all, a sour, sickly sweetness coated the air. The taint of my father's dark magic. It was a subtle poison that made the leaves on the trees seem to curl in on themselves. A wrongness that made the birdsong sound strained and thin. Ken walked beside me, his presence a solid, reassuring warmth in the corrupted landscape. We moved like ghosts, our steps silent, our senses stretched to their breaking point. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. We were invaders in my own home. My mind-walker ability, once a confusing hum, was now a finely tuned instrument. I cast it out like a net, searching for allies, for any mind that wasn't shrouded in the vacant uniform haze of my father's control. I found nothing, until a flicker of something familiar brushed against my consciousness. Liam. His mental signature was weak, muted, tangled in a web of confusion and fear. It was coming from a small, dilapidated hunter's cabin near the southern border. We approached with caution, circling the small building. I saw him through the grimy window. He was sitting at a small table, his head in his hands. And with him was the human girl, the one from the woods. My wolf bristled with a phantom jealousy, a ghost of a life that was no longer mine. I motioned for Ken to wait, and I stepped into the clearing alone. The human girl, Zara, was on her feet in an instant, her hands glowing with a pale, violet light. A shimmering shield of energy snapped into place between us. "Stay back," she warned, her voice trembling but firm. She was a witch, a powerful one, from the feel of it. Instead of drawing my blade, I reached out with my mind, not to attack, but to show her my intent. I projected an image of peace, of the darkness I'd seen on my father, of my own confusion and fear. Her eyes widened in surprise. The shield wavered. "Liam," I said, my voice soft. "He's not himself. I can feel it. A spell of compulsion." Zara looked from me to Liam, her expression torn. "It's a loyalty curse," she admitted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Tied to your father. I've tried to break it, but it's too deep, too tangled with his own magic." "You can't see the knot," I realized, the pieces clicking into place. "But I can." I stepped closer, and this time, the shield did not resist me. "Let me help you. Let me be your eyes." A silent, desperate trust passed between us. Two females trying to save the male we both, in our own ways, cared for. She placed her hands on Liam's temples, and I placed mine over hers. I closed my eyes and dived into his mind. It was a maze of shadowy corridors and locked doors. But with my sight, I could see the pulsating, ugly knot of dark magic wrapped around his heart. "There," I whispered. I focused my will, shining a psychic light on the curse, illuminating it for Zara. Her own magic, a clean, sharp, violet energy, surged forward, guided by my sight. She began to untangle the dark threads one by one. The parasite fought back, but together, we were stronger. With a final, agonizing pull, the knot shattered. A wave of black energy washed over the room and dissipated into nothing. Liam cried out and collapsed, his body slumping forward onto the table. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were clear. The vacant terror was gone. He looked at me, and the weight of what he had done, what he had been forced to do, crashed down on him. A single broken sob escaped his lips. His freedom was a bitter, painful thing. And in that moment of shared grief, we were no longer a rejected mate and her betrayer. We were allies. Chapter 14. The Den of Lies. Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing. We held on to it as the four of us, a rival alpha, a mind-walking outcast, a penitent warrior, and a human witch, made our way to the heart of the Moonwood Pack. Liam had confirmed the location of the artifact from my visions, a dark stone hidden in a vault beneath the Alpha's dais. But to get to it, we would need a distraction. A real one. Our plan was desperate. We would make one last appeal to the elders. We would show them the truth and pray that some part of the wolves they used to be was still alive, buried beneath the layers of dark magic. We clung to the hope that they could be saved, that we wouldn't have to fight our own people. It was a fool's hope. The Great Hall was colder than I remembered, the torchlight doing nothing to warm the oppressive, tomb-like chill in the air. The elders were already there, seated in a silent, perfect row, their faces impassive and identical. My father was not among them. "Elders of the Moonwood," I began, my voice stronger than I felt. I stood before them, with Ken a solid presence at my side, and laid out the truth. I spoke of the ancient prophecy, of the shadow parasite, of the lie that had fueled our feud with the Shadow Pack for generations. Zara stepped forward, her hands conjuring a swirling ball of violet light. Within it, she projected the image of the dark, writhing aura she could now see clinging to each of them, a visible representation of their corruption. They listened in absolute silence. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought we had broken through. I saw a flicker of confusion in one of the elders' eyes, a twitch of a muscle in another's jaw. They were still in there. But then the head elder, a wolf named Marcus, who had once bounced me on his knee, rose to his feet. His face was a mask of cold, fanatical fury. "Lies," he hissed, his voice devoid of any of its former warmth. "The words of a traitor, a witch, and the leader of a pack of mongrels mean nothing. You are the taint. You are the weakness our alpha swore to cut out." He pointed a finger at me, and his eyes began to glow with that same sickening, unholy light. "Seize them." The elders moved as one. They weren't the wise, deliberate wolves I had known. They were unnaturally fast, their bodies fueled by the dark magic that now animated them. A brutal, chaotic fight erupted in the middle of the Great Hall. Ken and Liam formed a defensive wall, their blades a blur of silver, holding back the tide of our former packmates. Zara threw up a protective shield, arcane bolts of energy striking the stone floor around us. I was frozen for a second, my heart shattering with the truth. They were too far gone. They weren't just influenced, they were consumed. My hope died, leaving a cold, hard resolve in its place. These were not my people anymore. They were monsters. Just as Ken drove back 2 elders, the main doors of the hall slammed open with a deafening crash. My father stood there. But it wasn't my father. He was larger, his body subtly twisted, his skin unnaturally pale. The shadowy parasite was gone. It was no longer clinging to him. It had merged with him, becoming part of his very flesh and bone. He let out a roar, a sound that was not entirely wolf nor man, and lunged, his claws extended like black obsidian daggers. We were outmatched. Utterly. "Run!" Ken roared, and we broke, fleeing the hall with the monster that wore my father's face hot on our heels. Chapter 15. No turning back. We ran. We fled through the familiar paths of the forest, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind us, the howls of enthralled wolves, and the monstrous, inhuman roar of the thing that was once my father. It was a desperate, panicked retreat. We were faster, but they were relentless, their stamina fueled by dark magic. The forest, once my sanctuary, had become a labyrinth of terror. Every shadow seemed to reach for us. Every rustle of leaves was the sound of an approaching enemy. There was no plan, no strategy. There was only the primal, instinctual need to escape, to put distance between us and the horror that pursued us. Ken's hand found mine, his grip a solid anchor in the chaos, and he pulled me along, his strength lending me speed I didn't know I possessed. Our desperate flight led us to the edge of the territory, to the high, jagged cliffs that overlooked the rushing river. A dead end. The churning whitewater rapids below were a certain death, and the only path back was now blocked by the army of our former pack. We were trapped, cornered on a narrow, crumbling precipice. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, and then they were there. The enthralled warriors formed a semicircle, cutting off any hope of escape. And then he stepped through them. The Alpha. He looked even more monstrous in the moonlight, his skin stretched taut over a frame that was no longer entirely human, his eyes glowing with a triumphant, malevolent light. He stopped at the edge of the cliff, a cruel, mocking smile twisting his lips. "Nowhere left to run, little traitors," he hissed, his voice a layered, grating sound. He looked at me, a flicker of what might have been paternal disappointment flashing in his corrupted gaze. "Did you really think you could defy me, daughter? Your loyalty was always your greatest weakness." His eyes then shifted to Ken, and his smile widened, becoming something truly evil. "And you," he sneered, "the great Alpha of the shadows, hiding in your caves, thinking you were safe. Your pack is so small, so vulnerable, so wonderfully easy to burn." The threat was a physical blow, a cold dread that washed over me, eclipsing my own fear. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about them, my new family, my new home. The last of my fear was burned away by a cold, protective fury. I stepped forward, my own blade gleaming, my stance no longer that of a retreating victim, but of a warrior ready to die for her own. Ken moved to stand with me, his shoulder brushing mine, a silent promise that we would face this together. My father, the monster, let out a low, guttural laugh that was the sound of grinding stone. He seemed to relish our defiance, to feed on our desperation. "You are brave," he conceded, the mocking tone never leaving his voice. "But you are also fools. You think you can stop my plans here, on this cliff?" He took a step closer, the dark energy rolling off him in palpable waves. "It's already begun," he whispered, his words a venomous secret shared in the dark. "While you were running to me, my true army was marching on them. Your precious den is already under siege." Chapter 16. The Home in Ashes. His final words were a death sentence delivered from a cliff's edge. It has already begun. Panic, cold and sharp, seized my heart. There was no time for a strategic retreat, no time for a plan. There was only the desperate, frantic need to get back. Zara, her face pale but resolute, slammed her palms against the stone precipice. "Hold on!" she yelled, her voice nearly lost in the wind. The rock beneath our feet groaned, and a narrow ledge, once invisible, tore itself away from the cliff face, forming a steep, treacherous ramp down into the darkness below. It was a path of pure magic, shimmering and unstable, but it was our only chance. We scrambled down the arcane bridge, the rocks crumbling into dust behind us, the mocking laughter of the monster who wore my father's face echoing from above. The journey back was a silent, heart-pounding nightmare. Every step was fueled by a rising tide of dread. The anchor bond, once a source of strength and connection, was now a conduit of pure terror. I could feel Ken's agony as if it were my own, a distant, psychic scream of his pack, of his family, being torn apart. He ran with the speed and desperation of a wolf whose heart was being ripped from his chest miles away. We didn't need to speak. Our shared panic was a language of its own, a frantic prayer whispered on every ragged breath. We arrived to the smell of smoke and blood. The entrance to the den, once a bustling hub of life, was a scene from a charnel house. The air was thick with the sounds of battle, the clash of steel, the snarls of fighting wolves, the screams of the wounded. The den was burning. Flames licked up the side of the granite cliff, consuming the woven tapestries and wooden structures that had made this wild place a home. My father's enthralled army, their eyes glowing with a faint, malevolent light, fought with the unfeeling precision of machines. The Shadow Pack fought with the desperate fury of a people defending their last stand. We didn't hesitate. We plunged into the fray, our blades a blur, our arrival a brief, shocking surge of hope for the beleaguered defenders. I found Liam, his face a grim mask of determination, holding the line with Zara, whose violet shields buckled and reformed around them. But it was Ken my eyes sought. He had gone feral, a true alpha unleashed, a whirlwind of black fur and righteous fury cutting a path toward the center of the chaos. Toward him. My father, or the monster he had become, stood in the heart of the battle, an island of calm in a sea of violence. He wasn't just fighting. He was directing his puppets with an unholy intelligence. I saw him lock eyes with Alara. The scarred she-wolf, who had once despised me, met his charge with a fearless roar, her blade a silver arc of defiance. He didn't even try to block her strike. He simply reached out a hand, his fingers unnaturally long and tipped with black claws, and pressed his palm against her forehead. Alara screamed, a sound of pure, soul-shredding agony. She collapsed to the ground, her body convulsing. It wasn't a killing blow. It was something far worse. A network of thin, black veins began to spread from the point of contact, crawling over her skin like a living poison. He wasn't just killing them. He was turning them. He was spreading his plague. Chapter 17. The Fraying Bond. The retreat was as sudden as the attack. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the Moonwood army pulled back, melting into the forest like specters, leaving a chilling silence in their wake. It wasn't a victory. It was a reprieve. A cat letting a wounded mouse catch its breath before the final killing pounce. The survivors of the Shadow Pack stood in the smoking ruins of their home, their faces a mixture of grief, shock, and a new, creeping horror. The fires were dying down, but the smell of ash and despair clung to everything. The wounded were everywhere, their cries a constant, sorrowful chorus. But all eyes were on Alara. They had moved her to the center of the clearing, away from the others. The black, creeping veins had spread, and her one good eye, once filled with fierce pride, now glowed with a faint, sickly light. She was fighting it, her body trembling with the effort. But we were all watching a war for her soul that she was destined to lose. The pack's spirit, once so wild and unbreakable, was shattered. And in their grief, they looked for someone to blame. An old wolf, one of the pack's elders, his fur matted with the blood of a wound on his arm, took a stumbling step forward. He pointed a trembling finger not at the horizon where our enemies had fled, but at Ken, at us. "This is your doing, Alpha," he rasped, his voice cracking with sorrow and accusation. "Your endless war with the Moonwood. Your quest for a vengeance that has cost us our home." His gaze shifted to me, and the raw hatred in it was a physical blow. "And her. You brought his daughter, his poison, into our den. She led this destruction to our door." A murmur of agreement rippled through the exhausted warriors. Their loyalty, once absolute, was fraying, eaten away by their loss. They looked at Ken's wound, at his exhausted frame, and they no longer saw an unbeatable leader. They saw a wolf who had failed them. They looked at me, and they no longer saw the she-wolf who had fought beside them. They saw the harbinger of their doom. The anchor bond which had connected Ken and me so deeply now transmitted a new shared emotion, the crushing weight of our pack's rejection. His own self-doubt, his own guilt, washed over me, mingling with my own until I couldn't tell which was which. We were utterly, completely alone, isolated in a crowd of our own people. As the sun rose higher, painting the smoke-filled sky in hues of orange and gray, a lone figure emerged from the woods. He carried a tattered white banner. It was a Moonwood messenger. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, his face devoid of emotion, a perfect puppet. He didn't need to shout. His voice, amplified by my father's magic, carried to every corner of the ruined den. "An ultimatum from the true Alpha," he announced, his words falling like stones into the grieving silence. "He does not wish to destroy his fellow wolves. His war is with the traitor who bears the shadow mark." The messenger's empty eyes found mine. Surrender the female, Zara. Give her to us, and the war ends. The Shadow Pack will be spared. Refuse, and we will return at dawn to finish what we started. Every man, every woman, every pup. Chapter 18. A Shard of Glass. The ultimatum shattered what little remained of the Shadow Pack's unity. The clearing erupted into a cacophony of desperate, angry voices. Some shouted to give me up, their survival instinct overriding any loyalty they once had. Others argued, their voices laced with a hopeless defiance. They were a pack tearing itself apart, broken by grief and fear. Unable to watch, Ken and I retreated to the hollowed-out shell of his cavern. It was a ruin, the furs and furniture nothing more than charred, smoldering heaps. The only home he had known since his exile was gone. He sank down onto a blackened stone, the great strength that had defined him seeming to evaporate, leaving him looking small and defeated. The weight of his pack's suffering, of their accusations, had finally broken him. He stared at the destruction, his golden eyes dull with a despair so profound it made my own soul ache. "They're right," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken sound. "All of them. The elder, the messenger, all of this." He gestured vaguely at the ruins around them. "Is because of me." His gaze lifted to meet mine, and the vulnerability there was a blade to my heart. "My revenge, my hatred for your father. I was so consumed by it, I dragged my entire pack into a war they couldn't win. I led them to ruin." He shook his head, a single, tearless sob escaping his chest. None of it was worth this price." His words were the final confirmation of the darkest fear I held in my own heart. He was wrong. It wasn't his fault. It was mine. I was the common denominator in all of this. My father's corruption, Liam's betrayal, the marking, the war, the destruction of this home, the ultimatum that now demanded my life. It all came back to me. I was a curse, a walking, breathing plague that brought ruin to everyone I touched. My desire to find a place of belonging had only resulted in the destruction of the one place that had taken me in. The despair was a physical thing, a cold, heavy ocean that filled my lungs, making it impossible to breathe. I was drowning in the totality of my failure. My gaze fell, and I saw it. A small, triangular piece of a looking glass, lying amidst the soot and debris. I stared into the shard, at the reflection of the she-wolf within. Her face was streaked with dirt and blood. Her eyes were hollowed-out pits of grief. Her hair was a tangled, matted mess. I didn't see a beta. I didn't see an alpha's daughter or an alpha's mate. I saw a creature that was utterly and completely broken. The sight was so pitiful, so pathetic, it was like looking at a stranger. And in that moment, at the absolute rock bottom of my despair, something inside me snapped. The grief was so absolute, the hopelessness so complete that it circled all the way back around on itself and found a single, tiny, hard kernel of pure, undiluted rage. Rage at my father, rage at the darkness, rage at my own weakness for letting it break me. I looked from my own shattered reflection to the defeated wolf I loved more than my own life. The despair was still there, a vast and terrible ocean. But now, it had an enemy. My own will. "No," I whispered, the word a tiny, impossible spark in the crushing darkness. "It's not over." Chapter 19. A Spark in the Dark. My whisper, "It's not over," hung in the dead air of the ruined cavern. It was a tiny, fragile sound, a single spark against a mountain of ash. Ken lifted his head from his hands, his golden eyes, so recently dull with defeat, focusing on my face. He saw the shift in me, the flicker of a warrior's fire that had refused to be extinguished. Before he could speak, before my newfound resolve could be tested, two figures appeared at the shattered entrance of the cave, silhouetted against the grim, gray dawn. It was Liam and Zara. They were covered in soot and blood, their faces etched with an exhaustion that mirrored our own, but their eyes, Their eyes burned with a fierce, urgent purpose. They had not been hiding. They had been hunting. "We found it," Zara said, her voice raspy, breathless. She held up a hand, and a swirling ball of violet energy materialized in her palm. Within it, a complex, shimmering map of light pulsed like a living heart. While the battle was raging, I wasn't just defending. I was tracing the energy, the dark magic. It's not just on the warriors, it's a web, and all the threads lead back to a single pulsing source. Liam stepped forward, his gaze finding mine, his expression one of grim atonement. "It's the Heartstone," he confirmed, his voice low. "An old relic kept in the sacred vault beneath the Alpha's dais. I never knew what it was for. Our history just calls it the soul of the pack." A bitter, ironic laugh escaped my lips. The soul of our pack was now the source of its damnation. Hope, an emotion I thought had died in me forever, began to stir. It was a painful, hesitant thing. "Can it be destroyed?" Ken asked, his voice rough with a dawning intensity. He rose to his feet, his towering frame once again radiating a flicker of his old, indomitable power. Sarah's expression was grim. "Not with brute force," she explained, her magical map showing a thick, shadowy shield around the central point of light. "The artifact is protected by a parasitic ward. It feeds on your father's life force, and the life force of every wolf he has corrupted. To attack it directly is to attack the entire pack." A wave of despair threatened to pull me back under. It was an impossible task. We couldn't fight our entire pack. But Zara wasn't finished. Her gaze moved between Ken and me, a new, sharp intelligence in her eyes. "But your bond," she said, her voice filled with a sudden awe. "It's not a normal mating mark. It's an anchor bond, an ancient and powerful form of magic I've only ever read about. It's a perfect, two-way conduit." She looked at me. "Zara, your Mindwalker ability isn't just for reading thoughts. It can see magic. You can find the fracture point, the one tiny flaw in the ward's design." Then she looked at Ken. "And your raw alpha power. It's the only thing strong enough to provide the energy needed to strike that point. The bond can channel your strength directly into her, guided by her sight." She took a deep breath. "It has to be both of you, working together. You are the only weapon that can destroy it." The revelation settled over us, a silence filled not with despair, but with a stunning, terrifying clarity. Our bond, the mark of my humiliation, the cause of this war, was also our only hope. Ken met my gaze across the ruins, and in his eyes, I saw my own resolve mirrored back at me. We had a path, a chance. We stepped out of the cavern and into the gray light, our new purpose a silent call to the few loyal warriors who remained. Chapter 20. The Quiet Before the Storm. We gathered in the ruins, a small, desperate handful of survivors around a map scratched into the ashen dirt. The air was no longer thick with despair, but with the tense, electric hum of a final, desperate plan. Every wolf present, the few Shadowpack loyalists, Liam and us, had lost something. A home, a brother, a future. All that was left was this one, razor-thin chance at redemption. There would be no grand army. There would be only us. "My father will be expecting an attack here," Ken said, his voice a low, steady growl that commanded the attention of everyone present. "He will expect us to defend, to rally, to wait for his final assault at dawn. We will not do what he expects." He looked at the map, his finger tracing a path into the heart of the Moonwood territory. "We are going to him." The plan was audacious. It was suicidal. It was perfect. We spent the next hour refining it, each of us contributing a piece of the puzzle. Ken, in a move of pure, breathtaking sacrifice, would be the main distraction. "I will challenge him directly," he stated, his jaw set like stone. "I will draw him and the bulk of his guard out into the open field west of the den. I will give you chaos." Liam, his face a mask of grim determination, would lead the rest of the Shadow Pack warriors. His task was not to fight the main battle, but to run interference, to protect Zara at all costs. "I will get her to the entrance of the vault," he swore, his eyes finding mine, an unspoken apology and a vow of loyalty passing between us. Zara's role was the most delicate. "The vault will be guarded by his most enthralled warriors," she explained, her fingers tracing a circle on the map. "I can perform a ritual of suppression. It won't break their curse, but it will confuse them, dampen the magic's hold for a few precious minutes. It should give you the opening you need." And then, there was me. My task was the final, critical strike. I would use the chaos Ken created to slip past the main force, use the window Zara opened to get past the guards and enter the vault. Once there, I would have to connect with Ken through the bond, draw on his power, and strike the heartstone at the precise fracture point only I could see. Every part of the plan had to work perfectly. If any one of us failed, we all failed. Before we left, as the last rays of sunlight bled from the sky, Ken pulled me aside. The sounds of our small war party preparing for their final journey faded into the background. He reached out, his thumb gently tracing the swirling lines of the mark on my neck. "I thought this was a brand," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for me. "A symbol of my revenge, of your humiliation." His golden eyes were filled with a raw, honest emotion I had never seen there before. "I was a fool. It's not a brand. It's a key." He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, the connection between us a warm, steady pulse. "Whatever happens, Zara, we face it together." In that quiet moment, our bond was solidified, not by passion or by fate, but by a shared, unbreakable purpose. As dusk fell, our small, desperate army moved out, leaving the ashes of our last refuge behind as we marched toward the heart of the storm. Chapter 21. Into the Lion's Den. The Moonwood Forest was a place of ghosts. Every tree, every stream, every shadow held a memory of a life that was no longer mine. But now, the woods were unnaturally silent. The dark magic that had taken root here had poisoned the very earth, driving out the normal wildlife, leaving behind an oppressive, watchful stillness. We moved like phantoms through the twilight, our feet making no sound on the damp soil, our scents masked by a shimmering illusion Zara had woven around us. The tension was a living thing, a coiled snake in my gut. We were deep in enemy territory, a tiny invading force against a corrupted army. Every flicker of movement, every distant snap of a twig sent my heart racing. We saw them soon enough. A patrol of 4 Moonwood warriors. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, their eyes holding that now familiar, vacant, glowing stare. One of them was a wolf I had grown up with, a boy named Finn who had always been clumsy and kind. Now he walked with the soulless precision of a machine, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his face a blank mask. A wave of sorrow so profound it almost buckled, my knees washed over me. We were not just fighting a monster, we were fighting the hollowed-out shells of our own friends, our own family. We flattened ourselves in the undergrowth, holding our breath as the patrol passed, their boots crunching on the leaves mere feet from where we lay hidden. I could feel Ken's rage through the bond, a low, simmering fire of protective fury. He mourned for his own lost pack, and now he mourned for mine. As we drew closer to the main den, the feeling of the dark magic intensified. It was a psychic pressure that made my teeth ache, a constant, low-level hum of malevolent energy that scraped against my mind. The anchor bond was a strange mixture of sensations, Ken's fierce determination, his simmering anger, and beneath it all, a deep, primal fear for my safety that he tried to hide. He was walking into a battle he did not expect to survive, all to give me a chance. I was no longer running from my past. I was marching back into its darkest corners, not to reclaim it, but to burn it to the ground so something new could grow. This was not a mission of revenge. It was an act of cleansing. We reached the ridge overlooking the clearing that housed the Great Hall. The place was on high alert. Dozens of enthralled warriors patrolled the perimeter, their movements synchronized and eerie. The entrance to the sacred vault, a set of heavy stone doors near the base of the hall, was guarded by a full 10 of the Alpha's elite guard. Getting through would be impossible. The plan was our only hope. Ken caught my eye from across the clearing, his face grim but resolute in the moonlight. He gave me a single sharp nod. Now. He drew in a deep breath and let out a roar. It was not a sound of rage, but a pure, untamed challenge, a direct personal insult to another Alpha. It ripped through the silence, a sonic boom of pure defiance that shook the very trees. Instantly, every head, every enthralled warrior, every guard snapped in his direction. A moment later, a deeper, more monstrous roar answered from within the great hall. The distraction had begun. In the ensuing chaos, as the guards abandoned their posts to answer the challenge, Liam, Sarah, and I slipped from the shadows and raced toward the unguarded vault. Chapter 22: Heart of Stone. The sounds of battle were a symphony of glorious, terrible chaos at my back. Ken's challenge had been met. As Liam bolted the heavy stone doors of the vault behind us, the thunderous clash of my new mate fighting the monster that was my father became a muffled, distant heartbeat. Here, in the cold, oppressive dark, a different kind of war was about to be waged. The air was frigid, still, and dead. In the center of the circular chamber, resting on a crude obsidian altar, was the Heartstone. It wasn't a gem. It was a chunk of rock that seemed to drink the light from the room, a pulsating void of pure, malevolent energy. Black, oily tendrils of magic, visible even to the naked eye, snaked out from it, sinking into the very foundations of the earth. This was the cancer that had poisoned my home. Sarah moved to the side, her hands already glowing with a protective violet light. "I will hold the door and keep the guards' minds clouded," she whispered, her voice tight with concentration. "But their master's will is strong. I can't give you long." I nodded, my own heart a frantic drum. This was it. I walked toward the altar, the cold radiating from the Heartstone seeping into my bones. I could feel its consciousness, an ancient, hungry, and intelligent thing that laughed at my intrusion. I placed my hands on its unnaturally smooth surface. Ice. A vicious, soul-deep cold shot up my arms. It tried to invade my mind, to show me visions of power, to tempt me with whispers of glory. It promised me the strength my father had never believed I possessed. I ignored it. I closed my eyes, shutting out the dark chamber, and reached for the one true source of power I had left: Ken. The anchor bond flared to life, a golden thread of light in the psychic darkness. I cast my consciousness across the battlefield, finding him instantly. I felt the burn in his muscles, the sting of a fresh wound on his arm, the primal, glorious fury of the fight. He felt my touch, and through the bond, I sent a single, desperate thought: now. I need you. I felt his immediate, unquestioning response. A tidal wave of raw, untamed alpha power surged through the bond, a torrent of pure energy that flooded my senses. It was almost too much to hold, a lightning storm contained within my own body. This new strength allowed me to push back against the Heartstone's influence and dive deeper. I wasn't just touching a rock anymore. I was touching the nexus of the curse, the command center of the hive mind. My consciousness slammed into my father's. I saw his deepest fear, the memory of his own father calling him weak, predicting the downfall of the pack under his leadership. I saw the moment he first found the Heartstone, its dark whispers promising him the strength to prove them all wrong, the power to create a perfect, pure, and unassailable legacy. It fed on his fear and twisted it into a fanatical obsession. I pushed past his memories, searching for the core of the ward. And then I saw it. A tiny, hairline fracture in the dark energy. It was the one part of my father's soul the stone could never fully corrupt. His genuine, twisted love for me. It was the one thing he was doing, in his own mind, to protect my future. That love was the flaw in the design. I gathered all of Ken's ferocious power, all of his love, all of my own grief and rage, and I focused it into a single, white-hot point of pure will. I aimed it at that fracture, and I shattered it. The Heartstone screamed, a psychic shriek of 1,000 tormented voices. A network of cracks spread across its dark surface, and then it exploded into a shower of lifeless gray dust. A final, soul-tearing howl of agony from outside echoed my victory. Then, blessed, absolute silence. Chapter 23. The Unraveling. The silence was more deafening than the battle that had preceded it. I stumbled out of the vault, leaning heavily on Liam, my body trembling with the aftershock of the power I had channeled. Zara followed, her face pale but her eyes shining with relief. We emerged into the first gentle light of dawn. The scene before us was one of quiet, frozen devastation. The fighting had stopped so abruptly it was as if time itself had been suspended. The enthralled Moonwood warriors, who moments before had been fighting like demons, now stood dazed, their eyes clear and wide with a dawning, sickening horror. They looked at their bloodied blades, at the wounded Shadow Pack warriors they had been trying to kill, and the truth of their actions began to crash down upon them. A low, collective moan of grief and shame rippled through their ranks. In the center of the clearing, Ken stood, his chest heaving, his body battered and bleeding but victorious. At his feet lay a crumpled figure, my father. The monstrous, twisted features had receded, the unholy light in his eyes extinguished forever. The dark magic that had given him his unnatural size and strength was gone, and what was left was a husk. He looked impossibly old, a frail, withered man shrunken in on himself, his alpha robes hanging loosely on his bony frame. The great, terrifying monster was gone. All that remained was a pathetic, broken man. Ken's golden eyes found mine across the clearing, and the ferocious warrior disappeared, replaced by a relief so profound it was a prayer. He took a staggering step toward me, and I ran to meet him, my own exhaustion forgotten. We collided in the center of the battlefield, his arms wrapping around me, holding me tight, his face buried in my hair. We were alive. We had won. We were an island of stillness in a sea of quiet, dawning chaos. The two packs, mortal enemies for generations, simply stared at each other, the haze of hatred and magic finally gone, leaving only the raw, awkward truth of their shared animosity. This was a wound that would not heal quickly, but it was a start. After a long moment, I pulled away from Ken's embrace and walked toward the still figure on the ground. Ken moved to follow, a protective glint in his eye, but I gave him a small shake of my head. This was something I had to do alone. I knelt beside the man who had been my father. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky. He was breathing, but his mind, his spirit, it was gone. The parasite had been the only thing holding him together, and without it, he had simply unraveled. All his anger, his ambition, his cruelty, it was all gone. There was nothing left. I looked at his empty face, and I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, not even anger. All I felt was a vast, hollow pity for the weak, frightened man who had chosen to make a deal with the darkness rather than face his own fears. I reached out and gently closed his eyes, a final, quiet act of forgiveness. It wasn't for him. It was for me. I was finally letting go of the girl who had spent her whole life seeking his approval. I stood up, turned my back on his broken form, and walked toward my future. Toward Ken. Chapter 24. A New Dawn. 3 days later, the smoke had cleared, but the scars remained. The two packs occupied the Moonwood Den, a tentative, fragile truce hanging in the air. The Shadow Pack had come not as a conquering army, but as a rescue party. They helped tend to the wounded, shared their supplies, and stood a quiet, respectful guard. The Moonwood Wolves, for their part, were lost. They were adrift in a sea of guilt and confusion, slowly coming to terms with the actions they had committed while under the influence of the Heartstone. It was awkward. It was tense. But there was no fighting. For the first time in centuries, the two packs were not at war. Liam, his face etched with a new, quiet authority, was overseeing the rebuilding efforts, his guilt now channeled into a fierce determination to heal his people. Zara worked alongside the pack's healers, her own magic a gentle, cleansing balm that soothed the lingering psychic wounds of the enthralled. A new council was being formed, with Liam representing the Moonwood and a wary but respectful Alara representing the Shadow Pack. The old ways were being dismantled, piece by painful piece, making way for something new. In the evening, I stood with Ken on the high, jagged cliff where we had once been cornered. The spot that had once been our dead end now felt like a place of new beginnings. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and violet, casting a golden glow over the territory that was now, somehow, home to us all. The rushing river below was no longer a symbol of our entrapment, but a promise of a future that would flow on, powerful and relentless. "It won't be easy," Ken said, his voice a low, thoughtful rumble beside me. He slipped his hand into mine, his fingers lacing through my own. "Teaching old enemies to see each other as brothers, there will be distrust. There will be anger." I squeezed his hand, leaning my head against his shoulder. "I know," I replied softly, "but we won't let them fail. We'll be the bridge." He turned to face me, his golden eyes soft in the fading light. He reached up with his free hand and gently traced the swirling, dark lines of the mark on my neck. The symbol of my greatest humiliation was now the emblem of our salvation. "I used to think this was a brand of my revenge," he murmured, "a way to take something from your father." A faint smile touched my lips. "And I thought it was the scar of my rejection." He shook his head, his thumb stroking my skin, sending a warm, pleasant shiver through me. "It's not a shadow mark, or a moon mark," he said, his voice filled with a quiet, profound certainty. "It's ours." He leaned in and captured my lips in a kiss that was not about passion or desperation, but about peace. It was a kiss of promises kept and a future waiting to be built. As we stood there, hand in hand, overlooking our new, united world, the anchor bond between us, once a conduit of pain and fury, hummed with a quiet, joyful, and utterly perfect harmony. I had not only found my power and my voice, I had found my true belonging.